I'm ready. Hi.
Yeah, me too. Just waiting for boom, we're live. Guys, how
Okay.
are you? How's everybody? So it's myself, Peter Borovykh, and our special guest, Jeff Wernick, and we're going to continue the discussion we started 2 weeks ago. It started with this whole Fed idea, but I think today we're going to just go and discuss some overall macroeconomic and socioeconomic situations that are happening in the world. Jeff, if you don't mind, thank you so much for joining again. I know you have a very busy schedule, so without further ado, let's I guess just jump in right into the little program I prepared for today for the listeners.
Perfect.
We did a little bit of um, question service, and some of the questions that people were very interested about. So all right, so let's begin.
Sure.
So the first one is we touched upon this last time, but let's just do this again. So S&P 500, right? So everything is kind of going back, normalizing. The Fed printed $6 trillion, which is enough to sustain the economy for another 1 quarter. That whole debt will, the bad debt will probably be sold to emerging countries, and emerging countries will sell it to even more developing countries. But what is your take right now regarding the S&P 500, the stock market, at this moment, specifically concerning July earnings that are upcoming the next, whatever, 4 weeks, four to
I
six
think the
weeks.
stock market has nothing to do with earnings anymore. It has to do with how long the game can continue with the Fed to print money to find third parties to buy stocks on its behalf. So to support companies. I mean, to the extent that the Fed is buying corporate debt and basically helping companies lower their cost of capital, they're helping stocks, right? If you look at the stock prices, the discount rate on the expected cash flows is, is their cost of capital. So to the extent that their earnings don't do well or don't grow very much, the Fed can continue to lower their cost of capital. So to the extent that the Fed is allowing them to lever more than the market would let them do at prices at interest rates much lower than the market would absorb, they're basically lowering their cost of capital significantly, and that significant reduction in the cost of capital, that wealth is not only accruing to the bondholders but to the shareholders.
Hmm.
So it's artificial. It doesn't mean you can if you're expected to earn $10 a year for 10 years and 10% is discount rate, and then all of a sudden zero is your interest discount rate, and then the value of that $10 a year is worth a lot more without the earnings changing whatsoever. So the Fed's policy has basically delinked the value of stocks from earnings. So as I said, it's all a game of financial engineering. It's all a game of driving down the cost of capital, and the expectation that it's an asymmetric game, because if the stocks go down, the Fed will come in. And the Fed will either come in by lowering the cost of capital, or they'll finance another central bank that will go buy a lot of stocks. As I think I might have mentioned last time, that the Bank of Japan owns 80% of the ETFs in Japan.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
So the Fed can go in and to the extent it doesn't have the authorization to buy stocks directly, it's easy for it to give money to the Bank of Japan or Swiss National Bank, give them a couple of $1 trillion, and have them buy indices, have them buy, the indices, and pump up stock prices. So
Hmm.
I think in the game of, given the fact that the mentality for, prior to Keynesian economics and the Great Depression, uh, you could say that we had a view of what was kind of like what Say's law, which has been trivially translated into supply creates its own demand, which is a trivial definition of what is meant by the work of Jean-Baptiste Say. So it was the depression that made people think about demand side management. So since the depression, we've thought about consumption, and how do we goose up consumption.
Hmm.
So we can have fiscal stimulus to basically give money to so we can have, like Trump has talked about, the $1 trillion infrastructure projects, so that we hire a bunch of people, to build stuff, whether it's needed or not needed, whether, and again, and what becomes a viable project, again, is a function of if the Fed lowers interest rates to zero or negative, then things that might not be viable at a 1% to 2% interest rate might become viable at a 0% interest rate. So as we change the time value of money, we're converting, a viable investment, non-viable investment to a viable investment. But it's not a viable investment because it's a true market return of cost of capital.
Mhm.
It's a Fed-induced cost of capital, so it's an artificial cost of capital. So we now engage in projects that have low marginal returns because we've pushed down artificially the cost of capital, and we're just increasing the malinvestment. But that increase in malinvestment is producing current economic growth. And when you're and the political cycle is a short cycle. So each president is motivated through thinking in very short term. So right now, to stimulate consumption, they're trying it through the wealth effect. Push up asset prices, have everybody feel everything is going really well, and and that will make people go out and figure out that they have more to leverage against, so they can buy more crap. So they have more collateral to go to a bank and say, I need to purchase more stuff,
Mhm.
not because their incomes are rising, but because stuff that they hold as collateral is worth a little bit more, so they can borrow more against it. But what's preserving that collateral value is the Fed-induced bubble on those assets.
Absolutely. Hmm.
So
So
how much room does the Fed have to go to do this game? It seems like they can extend it for a while longer.
who am they going to sell the debt to?
They just can print the money. We already have MMT. I mean, so when people talk about, the book that was just recently released by one of the more prominent MMT scholars, Stephanie Kelton, the book was released, I think, just this month. And I know many people have ridiculed that book, but the reality is we're implementing MMT policies because we're having, the type of spending, and it financed the way a lot of the MMT believe it should be spent. The government should spend a lot more, and they should just print money to spend it. So we already have MMT in practice. People don't want to call it that because it's discredited. So they call it different terminology, but essentially it's not significantly different than the stuff that you read in the work of the people who espouse, modern monetary theory.
So, following the advice of from the previous webinar of going into gold and BTC, and potentially some silver out of stocks and potentially out of USD as well, leads me to the next question. And the next question is, so quick intro. So this is our office here in New York City. About 2 weeks ago, this is right the next spot, literally the next spot. That was a gym, still is a gym. I'm assuming this business it's not a chain. The protesters wanted to exercise apparently. So who is behind this? It's, from what I see, from what I understand, it does not seem like it's a natural set of events that led to the riots globally. Well, definitely throughout the US and also globally. What is your take on this whole situation? Who is behind this? Who is driving these riots? Is it just the game of political elites, or what's going on?
I think it's a number of number of things. I think that the 2016 election was a rejection of the establishment. So Republicans went for Trump. Democrats really preferred, as far as the voters, not the elite and the establishment of the party, the voters went for Bernie Sanders. So, so that was a rejection of the establishment.
Mm-hmm.
So we still have a lot of angry people that are angry at the establishment. Unfortunately, and this is a point I try to make over and over again, I think the people who kind of like destroy support of capitalism are alleged capitalists. Because what we have is we have what I describe as a corrupt, crony, corporatist cartel. So we don't have capitalism. So I think the best description we have is not the seed that then is succeeded by capitalism, but the seeds of we have a crony economy, it's a corporatist economy, it's corrupt, okay, and it's cartel-like. So, and we call that capitalism. So the people who go around saying that socialism is terrible and that we have capitalism and we got to fight and preserve capitalism, what they're really fighting is not for capitalism. They're fighting for this crony, corrupt, corporatist cartel. Okay. Now this crony, corrupt, corporatist cartel is better than socialism. Okay, in my opinion, but it's not acceptable. So I think that for many of the people who have seen no real increase in if you look at the zip codes throughout the country, the majority of zip codes have seen little to no increase in their property values since 2007. Mm-hmm. So since 2007, if you take a look at most of the zip codes, you see most of the zip codes in the country have seen no appreciation or little appreciation in their property values. None of them have seen any real income increase in their real incomes. They've seen an erosion of their wealth, and they've substituted it with borrowing, debt, and that's been subsidized. So what we've done is we've continued this game of just basically lowering the cost of capital for everyone so that they can borrow more, and then hopefully eventually we'll either grow out of it, or we'll buy back all the debt, or we'll default on it, or we'll debase it significantly. So I think that there are a lot of angry people who have recognized that in a crony, corrupt system, corporatist system, they're losers in the game in Washington about how value is distributed. So before we had a big government, as I say, I wrote one article on how I discussed how, in my opinion, capitalism ended in 1913. The year we got the income tax and the Fed. So in 1913, spending in all government levels, federal, state, local, all the government was around 7% of GDP. That's how insignificant government was. So if we take a look at where we were in 1913 before we had the Fed, where we were from 1776 when we declared our independence to 1913, with the exception of the Civil War, and the Continentals that were issued during the Revolutionary War. Okay, we had no inflation. We had a small deflation, actually over that entire period of time. And we had a government that was not only insignificant in its claims against individuals from a tax point of view. We didn't have many administrative agencies. We didn't have much regulation. We didn't outlaw very much. We didn't require permits for very much. So we had basically, to a great extent, a fairly permissionless society where the government had almost no claims to people's product of their work ethic and the wealth that they created. And then in 1913, everything changed with the creation of the Fed and the income tax. All of a sudden, the government became the owner of all our money, and they decided how much of that money we get to keep. And they decided that whatever money we did get to keep, that they would actually debase it according to whatever was their convenience, but always against us. And so, to the extent that Washington made itself more relevant, then the game became, well, now let's spend more money, and now we're not about wealth creation, we're now about reallocation. So we got into the game of basically picking winners and losers, and to the extent that Washington has made itself more relevant, and the easiest way to see the relevance of Washington is the value of real estate around DC. So why is real estate around DC so expensive? It's so expensive because so many people are investing in the process of influencing what goes on in Washington. And why do they have to spend so much money influencing what goes on in Washington? Is because the consequences are great. Every time the government says anything, whether it's through an administrative agency or through legislation, and the abundance of administration agencies that exist, okay, whatever they're doing is about wealth transfer. Nothing government does creates wealth. Nothing. Okay, nothing. So the government is in the wealth destruction and wealth reallocation business. Wealth destruction in the sense that whatever the government does would reduce the amount of wealth that would be created in the absence of them doing nothing. So it's an opportunity cost. So wealth might continue to be created, but if the government did nothing, more wealth would be created than the government doing something. So there's an opportunity cost associated with everything the government does. And so relative to the best alternative of the government doing nothing, whatever the government does is suboptimal relative to the government doing nothing. So the best thing is for the government to do nothing. Ronald Coase, who did not describe himself as an ideologue, when he was asked about his opinion on regulation, and Ronald Coase, while he taught at the University of Chicago, he was not a Milton Friedman acolyte. So he was not necessarily someone very strongly ideological with respect to monetarism or rational expectations or the other schools of thoughts, or even the Hayekian point of view. But when interviewed and asked about regulation, what Coase said is, I'm not against regulation, but from what I've seen of every legitimate, rigorous academic study, okay, there's never been a good regulation. So his point was, if someone could write a good regulation, I'm not in principle against it. I just have never seen an example of a regulation that was well written, that created economic value. So if we take a look at real estate values in Washington and the population around the area, so how many people move there, they're moving there to influence the process. So the fact that so much money is spent to influence the process is an indication of how important the process has become. And there's so much money spent because people understand that they want to have an influence to become the winner of this game of reallocating wealth. So Washington has nothing to do with wealth creation. Washington is about wealth destruction and wealth redistribution. So this is independent of whoever occupies the White House. So the losers, and there are a lot of losers from this process, losers who have not been able to organize themselves, what appeals to them is socialism. Because people have not presented a better alternative to them. The real capitalists are not going and explaining to them that this is a crony system. So it's not really capitalism. So because they've been really bought off by the Fed, because the Fed is already paying, or almost every economist in the country is receiving grants from the Fed. So they basically are saying what the Fed wants them to say. So if you have a certain narrative you want to say, there's almost no academic institution, that will hire you, and there's almost no think tank that will hire you because of the people who fund those think tanks. They use those think tanks also to influence policy according to what there's convenience. The Koch brothers will give money to the Cato Foundation because they want, they don't want their borders, so they want, a free flow of labor because they just want to have as low cost possible for their businesses. So I don't think it's a philosophical thing with respect to human rights. It's an economic issue, and I'm not taking a part in the immigration issue. My point is that people fund think tanks, to have think tanks produce literature that will influence public policy to the benefit of whoever is writing the check for that institution. And generally, it's not a philosophical belief. It's not a deeply held philosophical belief. So it's a convenient belief for what they perceive is in their best interests. And people spend a lot of money doing this. So the game has become so corrupt because once we made the government relevant and once we centralized power, it became easy to corrupt things. Then when you have to have decentralized power, you have to corrupt a lot more people, and it's much more difficult than the centralization of authority. So we had a system that was designed to be basically decentralized, and after 1913, the whole rules of the game would change to make it a more centralized system, and it became more consequential. And so the vested interest of manipulating that system, and so far an element of society, I don't want to call them privileged, I don't want to refer to them, by any sort of race, color, gender, greed, but the reality is there are groups of people who've been successful at being able to organize themselves to have a lot more influence in the process.
Jeff, you mentioned before 1913 was more decentralized. Could you touch upon that specifically? Why more decentralized? Well, you mentioned the
Fed. It was centralized because the federal government couldn't do anything. The federal government had no money. Mm-hmm. So the federal government was not writing many rules or regulations, and it had no money. And it couldn't print money. So how much authority do you have with an institution, that really doesn't have a checkbook? Mm-hmm. What can it do? Declare war? I mean, that was it. And they declared war, then they knew they would have to go and either issue war bonds or institute a tax to finance the war. So that was unpopular. So we were basically governed on a local level, as our initial design was a system designed to be very local.
So all of these,
and if you have a local community, okay, the best thing is competition. Okay, if I have a mayor that's a moron, I move out of that city and move into another city. Now there's a transaction cost associated with moving, okay, but there's a much lower transaction cost associated from one city to another. At least you have the freedom to do that, and you don't need permission to do that. To travel from one country to another does require permission. So if we basically had mobility that required no permission anywhere in the world, then people would just move out of bad governance jurisdictions and move to the best governance jurisdictions. So the best disciplinary force is not voting at the ballot, but voting with our feet, voting with our wallets. So, as what Albert Hirschman called, I don't remember the order he said it, exit, voice, and loyalty. So you have a country, we're loyal to it, then the country does something you don't like, and then you start complaining, and then eventually some people say, this is so much of a piece of shit, I'm going to find a jurisdiction to live under. The problem is that in any country, if you think your country is a shithole and you want to move somewhere else, there's a high transaction cost associated. First you have to pay all these taxes to clean up your status in that country, and then you have to get the authorization of doing something else, and then whatever business you're in, if you're a lawyer, whatever degrees you have, you can't apply them in the new jurisdiction. So moving outside of countries has very high transaction costs. The best thing is to eliminate all transaction costs associated with as much moving, and then we get the worst jurisdictions would find that they would govern nobody, because nobody would voluntarily accept that type of governance if they could freely choose the best form of governance. But because every government knows they're a piece of shit, okay? They want to keep their own people locked in, and they want to lock other people out because they know they suck. So all of the governments. So I'm not making this a partisan, Democrats, Republican. The president really can't do much of that. It's the culture in Washington. So I think many presidents would like to change the culture of Washington, but it's the culture of Washington. The Washington culture is a deeply corrupt culture. So changing an individual is not going to change the culture of Washington. So if we had, so now people say, I want to defund the police, or they want to do whatever. Let every city do whatever stupid thing they want to do. And then I understand it's going to be convenient for those people to say, well, I voted for somebody who said they would protect my streets. And if they're not protecting their streets and they don't move out, or they don't remove the person who's not doing the job, they only have themselves to blame for it. At some point, when do we have a society where people again become, sovereign individuals, and they basically say, I want to opt out of having any sort of responsibility. You're my delegated agent, and I just hope you do a good job. But I'm not going to discipline you if you do a bad job. That's our fault. It's our fault that we've accepted this system. So I have no sympathy or empathy with any act of violence. Okay, I think that there's no justification for violence under any circumstances. I do not think that this was sometimes there's a catalyst that gives an excuse to go out. And you remember when we had the Benghazi incidents, and
Yep.
the Obama administration said it was the videotape.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we've had cops shoot people.
They'll
We've had
always find a
cops
reason.
kill people, but suddenly I think this all has to do with a bunch of groups, including the media, the mainstream media, the Democratic Party, George Soros, the Obama people, and all these groups sitting back and wanting people in November when they go to the ballot to have Trump fatigue. So, and I don't say this as someone who says, I'm a big Trump supporter. I'm not voting. So I don't, I always say I'm going to, whatever, I always assume that whoever's elected, what they're going to do is cause harm to me. So, and I'm always going to be smart enough to figure out how to make money off of all the garbage that they do. So I really am indifferent on what happens in an election. So, but what I do think, as an observer, trying to be a neutral observer into this, if you look at like the behavior of the Obama administration, and again, I don't like this to be a partisan politics because I'm not a partisan person, but when Obama went after a lot of the banks and other institutions, he did some fines to them, and some of the fines were pretty significant amounts, not significant in the terms of the breach and the benefits of the breach. So if J.P. Morgan, did something inappropriately and they made $100 billion off of it and paid a $10 billion fine, of course, if somebody said, would I pay $10 billion to make $100 billion, I would do that trade any day.
Done.
So the
Yes.
government came to me and said, do whatever you want, just give me 10 billion. Yeah, so if I made 100 billion and had to give them 10 billion, I'd be a happy person. So the 10 billion sounds like a lot, but the 10 billion is never presented in the context of what the benefit was associated with the criminal act. So but what did they do? They wanted to give the incentives for these financial institutions to settle financially. And then they gave that money, they distributed to all these grassroots organizations. So I think, if you take a look at, in my opinion, if you take a look at the evidence associated with, the Russian collusion and all the things that Trump and all the unmasking that was going on, it seemed to me that I think that there was a credible case, that while the Obama administration never believed Trump would win the election, that when he did the election, that they wanted to make sure that he had a difficult time governing after he won the election. And they might have thought that what they were doing was actually in the best interest of the country. So I don't want to sit back and say they had bad motivations. They might have believed their own motivations and might believe their own motivations were legitimate motivations and that they were doing what they thought was in the national's best interest. But it certainly probably was not legal, okay, and it certainly was not constitutional. But they funded a lot of these groups. So a lot of these radical groups got a lot of money during the Obama administration. So they were well funded, and a lot of it was occurring near the end of the Obama administration. So it seems to me, between the money that Soros doles out, Tom Steyer doles out, what Obama doled out to these groups, and the efforts, you've had several generals talk about they're going to do a PSYOP campaign, a counter-PSYOP campaign. So it seems to me there's a large establishment element, that hates the principles. And again, I'm not endorsing Trump. What I'm saying is that there's a group out there, there's establishment that doesn't like the counter-establishment movement. So, and they have a strong interest in seeing the counter-establishment movement defeated. And they're gonna do whatever they can to do. And so, because the economy had been going pretty well, the Democrats are not perceived as credibly better on the economy than Trump is. I think the only thing they have for November is to say, aren't you tired of seeing all these riots everywhere, all these activities? And over time, with the Stockholm syndrome, that more and more people will identify with the people who they claim the media is helping to establish all these people who are committing these criminal vandal acts. I consider them subhuman, as victims, and will sympathize with them. So we'll no longer be outraged by them. We're going to sympathize with them. And the more time they have with creating sympathy for their destruction and violence, the destruction of property and violence, which is completely inexcusable, that maybe that's the best way to defeat Trump, and there's a lot at stake at the election. So I think, given what people think is at stake at the election, this sounds like a reasonable strategy, that between all the, never Trumpers, anti-Trumpers, Trump derangement syndrome people, and all the other Trump haters, and again, I'm not saying this is a Trump supporter, but I'm just an observer to this, have an incentive that there be chaos from now till November. And that basically people who even like Trump will say, I sympathize with all these people. I like Trump. Maybe I'll stay home. Maybe I'll have less enthusiasm. Or maybe now I just want this to end. And as much as I like Trump, I want it to end. So that's what I believe what's going on. And so I think this is likely to persist, until Election Day. And if Trump wins and is reelected, it'll probably transform and continue, because it started the day he was inaugurated, and we'll have more of this, another 4 years. Today it was reported that, one is, you see now networks trying to demonetize think tanks that are like the Heritage Foundation. So what's consequential about the Heritage Foundation? The Heritage Foundation is a think tank that has been basically mostly responsible for making the recommendations for the judges Trump has chosen. So now they say, okay, now to the extent that Trump is president 4 years from now, maybe the Heritage Foundation will no longer come up with giving him another 4 years to come up and basically further, put more conservative justices on the court. So if you look at the effort to basically demonetize these conservative groups that are identified with having supported the administration, and now you had Zuckerberg announce that people can, determine to shut off their ads. So the workers at Facebook said, we don't want Trump on the platform. Zuckerberg must have had a deal with Trump that said, I don't have problems with you. Approve my Libra deal. I'm not your enemy. So he's trying to run a balancing act of saying, Trump can put the ads on, but we'll have our board of experts, determine what a political ad is and give people the right to just basically shut them off. And who knows if some Facebook engineers will not do what Twitter does and throttle the ads themselves and shut it off voluntarily. Who knows? Nobody will ever know, because nobody will get inside the company and ever get a disclosure, a discovery process where they can really see how these companies are behaving. So, we basically have a civil war in this country.
That is done cyber, or that is actually done? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is it happening?
There's no dialogue, because if you look at the group in Seattle and some of the claims,
it's crazy.
The claims had nothing to do with racism. It has to do with what they envision of social justice and economic justice. Years ago we had, Hayek talk about, and basically talk about how such an illegitimate term social justice is. Unfortunately, we don't have people today with the courage that Hayek had who want to take the hit of not being described as a horrible human being, because they think this whole concept of social justice is a bullshit concept.
But then you lose everything. If you stand against it, you lose everything. You lose your potential.
Yeah, because there's a mob. This is the Twitter mobs, right? It's like Robespierre. They want to take you out, and they want to put the guillotine. I'm sure if these people, I'm sure many of these people would like to do it. I'm sure we have a number of people in the country that would like to go to the White House, and take Trump out, and and guillotine him. And guillotine him a whole bunch of other things. There's a great libertarian scholar, Walter Block. People are now looking to get him fired. You had the guy from the University of Chicago, Harold Uhlig, who has now had disciplinary measures. He was one of the editors of the Journal of Political Economy, was one of the most respected journals. So we have this cancel culture that's a huge mob that are behaving like the French Revolution, that they claim certain values of liberty, equality, fraternity. But we understand what happened when they got power. Okay, they certainly did not support liberty. They certainly did not support brotherhood. Okay, and equality is, what definition of equality are you using? So if equality is a definition of equality of outcome and liberty are inconsistent concepts. To create equal outcomes, you have to give up all your liberty. So we either have liberty, or we give up all our liberty to create equality. So they're completely incompatible concepts. And there's a group of people that feel that they've been losers in a corrupt system. They hate capitalism. If you look at most college campuses, they hate capitalism. Not only the cronyism, they just hate capitalism. They hate the concept of individual responsibility. They just think it's the Hillary Clinton, it takes a village, that nobody's really accountable for anything they do, and nobody created anything of value. Anything that was created of value was done by everyone. So they don't really believe in property, and ownership, because they believe in the tragedy of the commons, that everything is owned by the common. So, and
why is it happening
and
now?
that's the agenda. Because there's so much dissatisfaction with the establishment. People's view of their future prospects are much lower now. In the past, and I think I might have said this last time, if the reason why people were willing to not want to overtax the rich is the perception that one day they would be rich. So if less people believe they will ever be rich, the more they want to punish the rich and transfer wealth to them, and the more they want to demonize the rich, because they don't think that one day they'll ever be that rich person. So their game no longer is about me having a dream that I will be a wealthy person. It's me having a dream that this is a corrupt country, that these are privileged people. They don't deserve what they have. I'm never going to get it. But whatever they have, they didn't earn. I own a piece of that, and they should give me my fair share. So I think, given the fact that we are so much in debt, and I do think that leverage and borrowing destroys our values. Once we, if we lose the culture of thrift and savings, and just borrow, instant gratification, okay, we're destroying to a great extent our own moral fabric. What individual values that are important to us. So as we've debased our own values, we've debased our money, we debase everything, and we debase ourselves in the process. So as bad as DC is, we have ourselves to look into the mirror for how bad they are, because most of the people still want something from it. They refuse to say, I'm a sovereign individual, fuck you, DC, I don't need you for anything, okay? So few people, there's still too many people who say, this is what I kind of feel, but practically speaking, I need them. So because I philosophically, I'm a kind of libertarian, but as a practical reality, I want to make some money, so I understand that if I really want to make some money and support my family, have nice things, I got to play the game. So they've written enough rules that basically they've corrupted enough people, where they've made the price of having integrity a high price. That's the perversion of the system. The perversion of the system is it discourages integrity. Okay, it discourages individual responsibility. Okay, it encourages you enter the club, and then you try hard to get all the perks of being members of that club, and so the competition is to be inside that club. So it's a perverse form of competition.
But if you still want to support your family and make sure your family has more or less sufficient way of living and standards of living, you must play the game. But the game does not allow for second opinions. Then how do you make money if you do not have initial capital inherited or acquired prior to this whole thing by luck? Or like
the most valuable capital is human capital. Yes. People have to learn to develop a skill that other people will value. And if you develop a skill that other people will value, then you can make money. So if your skill is, I want to be in a business where I need a whole bunch of government permits, yes, it's more and more things. That's why the government likes the permit business. One, it raises money. without raising income taxes. Two, it gets you more accustomed to knowing that everything you want to do requires their permission. So we've come from a society that was essentially permissionless, and now it's a society where they want you to get used to basically requiring permission for everything you do.
Right.
So they want to brainwash you into thinking that you need permission for everything. So therefore, then you become more obedient. So so it takes a lot of courage, to be the type of character that that Ayn Rand described in Howard Roark in The Fountainhead. Those who say, I really believe in myself, who have devoted themselves to becoming expert at something, and have the confidence that no matter what government does, they're going to figure out how to live a life of integrity and have enough money to have some level of quality of life without becoming a dependent or a subject. So with citizens, we're not subjects, okay?
So dedication first, good values and numbers first, some confidence and ability to make a living, and hopefully quantify it down the road for yourself and for your loved ones, for your family. That's a difficult task. You're not the only one calling on for courage. Because right now, from what I see,
Well, it's how I lived my life. Yeah. I don't do anything that has required the government permission. Mm-hmm. I went out and I invested in myself. I read, I learned, I determined what I wanted to do. I devoted myself to becoming expert at something. When I started my first business, okay, I gotta tell you, I was married in June of I've been married twice. My first marriage was June of 1977. Okay, so I told my wife the night before the wedding. Okay, at that point in time, I was still a student at the University of Chicago, but I was trading. So I was trading options and futures. So I was trading at the CBOE, CBT, and the Merck. So I was trading equity options. I was trading financials and commodities and foreign exchange. So so I had told my wife to be that on Friday before the Saturday wedding that I was going to go and close out my positions. So I decided not to do that, and so I told my wife to be on. I went to the house on Friday night to see her before the wedding, and I said, it's boring to take a honeymoon. So everybody does honeymoons. I said, what if we don't make the whole summer a honeymoon? She said, what do you mean by that? I said, yes, let's go to a hotel around the Chicago area every weekend for June, July, and August. And she said, why? I said, because Monday I want to go back and trade. So, and from then until my 10th wedding anniversary, I didn't take a day off, okay? So I went 10 years, I worked Christmas, I worked Yom Kippur, okay? I worked Rosh Hashanah, okay? 365 days a year, okay? I worked. So that's the commitment I made to making myself a success. Never did I do anything that was knocking on the door of Washington and asking permission and looking to do things. I invested in me and my success. So every individual can determine what trade-offs they want in their life. Some people want a 9-to-5 job, and there's nothing wrong with wanting a 9-to-5 job. So I'm not making a value judgment about that. Entrepreneurship, to become a successful entrepreneur, requires a significant amount of devotion, and many people don't want the trade-off. They don't want whatever benefits that come from that type of accumulation of wealth. They don't want to do that trade-off. I was curious. So I wasn't even driven by money. I just wanted to be the best at everything I did. So that's all that I wanted to do, is I wanted to learn a lot, and whatever I wanted to learn, I wanted to be the best at. And I devoted myself hours to be the best at it. So when I would my wife would come to my office every day. We'd have lunch together. Then at dinner time, I would go out and meet her for dinner. I would then stay with her until she went to sleep. And when she fell asleep, I would go back to the office and start working, and then come back for breakfast to meet her for breakfast, then go back to the office. She'd come to the office for lunch. Yeah, then I would go out to dinner with her. Then I would stay with her until dinner, and then until she's asleep. And then I would go back to work. I was willing to make that commitment, to do that. And
How
still,
many
even
hours?
at the age I am right now, which I guess is 64, I work. I still work 7 days a week. I don't do it because I need the money. I do it because I love to learn. I don't ever want to stop learning. I don't want to think that the days of me accumulating human capital ever my days of accumulating human capital will end the day I'm cremated. So up until that point in time when I'm cremated, I devote my life to accumulating human capital. Some people decide that they want to invest less in human capital, and so they should expect a different outcome if they don't make the same type of investment in their own human capital. And again, these are just preferences that people have. There's no wrong with whatever people choose. It's only wrong with because of what you chose to now make somebody else responsible for your choices. Okay, if somebody's made choices that don't make them independent, okay, that doesn't mean they have a claim to me because I made different choices. That's bullshit.
How many hours you work per day, roughly?
10 to 12.
10 to 12.
Yeah.
7 days a week. So it's all possible. So you are the living dream of how it all can be done without going to the DC and trying to assemble and trying to pretty much adapt to whatever they want you to adapt to. What about Elon Musk in this situation?
No, I like the world adapting to me. So I don't want to adapt to the world. The people around me, they all know they have to adapt to me. So, and if they don't like adapting to me, they don't have to be in my universe. So that's their free choice to determine whether, and adapting to me just means accepting me for who I am. So it doesn't mean for people who I work with, I don't govern them or micromanage them or force things on them. All they know is I am who I am. So which is somebody who's very blunt. So people who work close to me have to understand that they're dealing with someone who will be very, very blunt. And many people don't like bluntness. So I'm not rude, but some people confuse bluntness with rude. I'm never personally insulting, but I'm very blunt. So some people have to get, people don't want to deal with somebody who's blunt, if he wants to deal with somebody who will always tell them the truth rather than what they think they want to hear, then that person is not going to be compatible with me. And they're not in my universe, but they're not in my universe as both of us, because they won't be happy, and I won't be happy being somebody different than who I am. So, that to me is how you preserve your integrity. Is that I'm a sovereign individual, so I don't subordinate myself to anyone. And I don't expect anyone else to subordinate themselves to me. So I respect people being blunt with me. Everyone that works with me has the same ability to be blunt with me as the way I am with me. They can call me, and every word that I use to describe them, they have the same right to describe me. So very democratic in that way.
So pretty much this credit economy, right? It's like right there where the economy sustains itself. And you mentioned that pretty much 20 minutes ago. The economy sustains itself. You borrow, you live based on that. What is going to happen to this economy? Is it going to change? Or this series of couple of months of Corona and then riots is just a natural set of events to redistribute the wealth throughout the elites? So pretty much,
I think eventually we'll see a movement towards more socialism and more government encroachment in our day-to-day lives. I think eventually we'll see a UBI. Again, I'm not supporting any of these policies. I want everybody in Washington to go home, okay, and disappear, not through violence. I just would want them all to just disappear and stay out of our lives. But to the extent that that's not going to happen, okay, they're going to come. The Social Security is bankrupt this decade. Most of our contingent debt is coming to the point where they're going to be bankrupt, where their checks will bounce, where there's limited economic opportunity. because during this coronavirus crisis, a lot of small businesses will never return, and we're going to see a concentration of economic power. The Fed is not buying the bonds of small businesses; they're buying them for big businesses. Small businesses have seen an increase in their cost of capital, not a decrease in their cost of capital. So the cost of entrepreneurship has gone up. The cost of capital for a crony has gone down. So we're going to have bad allocation of capital. We're going to have more economic wealth concentrated. And the way the more economic wealth will then appease those who are losers will be eventually through a UBI. So and they will think that UBI will satisfy the losers who they think have low expectations and will be kind of cheap to buy off. Universal health care, UBI, and they'll shut up. So so that's what I think is likely to happen. This decade.
This decade. So all of these
Yes.
government Ponzi schemes are finally coming to an end with something.
This decade, yes. This decade.
By 2030.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this decade.
So what's going to happen to the generation of those who rely on those Ponzi schemes for their retirement?
They're going to be pretty fucked. They should rely upon gold and Bitcoin. So they shouldn't rely upon the Ponzi schemes for having wealth in the future. They should rely upon something the government can't debase.
Mm-hmm.
And the government is making it more. The government is raising the cost of carry of being in something that can't debase by creating a bubble and things that they can manipulate. You follow? So if I can goose up stock prices and goose up debt prices, then I tell people, don't worry about buying Bitcoin. The stocks will be here and they continue to do well. So the government wants to increase the cost of holding Bitcoin by pumping up the assets that they can control and manipulate. So, and as long as they can keep them, that's the best case that they can make about why people should hold Bitcoin or gold. So I think long term, betting against the government is a smarter bet than betting that they can sustain this Ponzi for a significantly longer period of time.
The conspiracy question behind Bitcoin: what if somebody's controlling Bitcoin as well? Or what if somebody can create another currency? I'm not talking about Libra. I'm talking about as ambitious as decentralized project as Bitcoin, for example, because they definitely have the governments have the resources to market whatever the new project as this new libertarian anarchist project. Why don't they do that?
Well, the challenge for coming out with something that's quote unstoppable, okay, and I put that between parentheses, is what makes Bitcoin better, in my opinion, others. Well, one is its monetary policy, but the difference is it evolved organically. So, in other words, there was a protocol in the public domain that had no author, and it's really true. It's not technology that's permissionless. Itself, it's permissionless. Ethereum requires permission. Okay, so if Ethereum was concerned about what would happen on whether it would be considered a currency or an asset or thing like that, and Joe Lubin and Vitalik were interested in this issue, and they spend time in Washington, D.C. trying to influence how Ethereum was attempted to be defined. Now in Bitcoin, the only people really trying to influence that were the exchanges, okay, who want to see it traded. So they wanted to see any rules that would just encourage trading. But the issue of whether people were concerned about its characterization of it being an asset or a currency, for me as a Bitcoin holder, believing in it as a store of value, at the end of the day, I didn't care. So, as a matter of fact, I prefer that they consider it an asset, rather than a currency, because then to the extent it has limited controls over exchange, then now classifying it as a currency, because I don't want to spend it, I want to hold it. But I was pretty much indifferent to it. So, in what we define now as, if you look at what the definition of a utility token is, in order to not require, registration, a utility token is basically somebody coming up with a currency that will not be defined as a currency, but behaves like a currency. And what do I mean by that? The SEC's guidelines on utility tokens is, by design, they have to be designed to either, you can't raise money to build the project out. The money has to be used inside the network. The money has to be designed so that its price is either stable or declines.
Mm-hmm.
So you're clearly not going to get. So basically, it's functioning as a currency, but it's a currency that can only be spent in that network, and none of these networks can really grow. So, and if they attempt to grow, then the regulators will come in and put all these rules on it. Maybe say, to be involved in this, you're now a bank, and everyone who mines it has to get a license because they're printing a currency,
That's what's
and they're
happening.
subject to OCC regulation. Yes. So you need permission for that. So once you design something that requires permission, you're now given government control over it. Bitcoin didn't require anyone's permission. Nobody raised money. People just started organically mining it, and there's nothing, and there's no requirement, there's no law that says I can't go out there, run an algorithm, and get rewarded with this. What if I move it? How it's taxed, the government can have, but the act of creating it doesn't require anyone's permission. So whoever would design something that would compete with Bitcoin would have to come up with a better monetary policy, something that would be cheaper to mine, still be decentralized, and require no one's permission.
So permission.
And if a project came out like that, I would support that project. But it has to have those attributes. But people are not designing projects with those attributes.
So the attributes being permissionless, right? Permissionlessness. A number of of the top, I'd say of the 1,000 projects, the majority I would say is permission, positioning themselves as permissionless. And what are the other attributes?
No, the ledger is permissionless. To do the project requires permission.
In terms of to become a developer or to become a miner, validator, you mean those kind of permissions?
To issue the token requires
permission.
To
issue the tokens, absolutely, yes.
Bitcoin can be issued without permission. Permission can be granted, permission can be taken away.
Mm-hmm.
It's controlled. Once it requires permission, it's their game.
Now, what about...
They control the rules of the environment that you operate under. They can't control the rules in Bitcoin. Bitcoin does not require any permission whatsoever because no money was raised. Nobody went out and said, I have this project, give me money, and by giving me money, you'll make money by giving me money.
Absolutely.
Okay?
Of course. Nobody funded it originally. Nobody capitalized. It grew organically. Question about China.
So the difference between the blockchain being the ledger itself being permissionless than the token itself being permissionless. So people confuse the technology, because a lot of the people who got into this were just technology people. They didn't know anything about law. They didn't know anything about economics. Okay, all they thought was I could write a white paper and be a millionaire overnight. So they weren't very thoughtful people, and they might have been really good tech people, but they were not business people. They were not thoughtful, and that's why. And they developed basically scam projects, and maybe they weren't even attempting to scam. So since I don't know enough of them, but I can tell you a lot of the people came to me wanting my assistance, wanting to use my name.
Of course,
their projects were scammy projects.
Absolutely, of course, absolutely. Yeah, big name, famous, and any endorsement would help them raise another couple of $1 million and not deliver to the users. Question about Bitcoin from that perspective is, that's an old question, but still, this decentralization still depends on the mining equipment, and a huge portion of the mining, maybe not, well, some people claim 60%, maybe not 60%, is in China. China is under control. China has a separate, special culture. It's under control by the government, allowing way less flexibility when it comes down to entrepreneurship, if necessary.
They're not significant barriers to entry in mining. What
if you?
There've been some mining companies that have gone public. There's a lot of competition for being efficient at mining, and that's all you care about. I mean, to the extent that what you do is if you think the protocol will not be good at falsifying the ledger, that's all you want the miners to not be able to do is to falsify the ledger. You can't have double spending. You can't have counterfeit coins out there. So at this point in time, there doesn't seem to be the problem that the ledger can't be trusted.
I'm
but
sure.
Yes, if the day you can't trust the ledger, yes, then Bitcoin is debased if people think that the ledger can no longer be trusted.
So when you will not be a holder of Bitcoin, because gold is a little bit different. Gold has been there for centuries. When you personally would not be a holder of Bitcoin, what circumstances would let you say, okay, I'm out? And how will you be out?
If a token that had better attributes came out, I value it based upon the attributes of it being, better technology with respect to the protocol, that it's permissionless. The token itself, not just the ledger, the token itself was permissionless, and it was cheaper to mine. So if it had dominant attributes to Bitcoin and it had a equal or better monetary policy. I don't know what I like Bitcoin's monetary policy. And I like the predetermined monetary policy in the absence of any sort of rule. I think it was really well designed from a game theory point of view. But if somebody came up with something better that I hadn't thought about, and after reading it, I'd say, shit, this is even better than Bitcoin, then I would start selling Bitcoin and buy that. Or if I believe the government would go back to hard money. If governments went back to hard money, then I would basically start selling Bitcoin if the governments were committed to hard money. And if they were committed to hard money, then my gold would go up a lot. So which is why I hold gold, and Bitcoin. So holding gold is my bet that in case government doesn't go to hard money, if they're going to go hard money, it'll be gold. A lot of central banks are accumulating a lot more gold. More banks are trying to accumulate, but I don't know really sure how much the gold accumulation relates to how much more money they're printing. So I have not looked at the gold coverage ratios with respect to M2, and are the gold coverage increasing as a percentage of M2, decreasing, and if they are increasing, to what extent is it significant? How much more of their M2 is now collateralized by gold? So I haven't really looked at the quality of money. Because I think it's all shitty. But if the government's indicated that they were going to balance their budgets, shrink, deregulate, eliminate taxes, abolish the Fed, then if they do all that, I will sell my Bitcoin. So until a better token comes along, or until the governments behave that way, I'll hold my Bitcoin.
Understood. Now that's very, very clear. I think we're going to wrap up. I mean, thank you so much. I did not answer more than half of the questions I had written, to be honest, about macro, about emerging economies, about real estate, commercial real estate. There's so much stuff to cover up. So, Jeff, thank you so much for your insights. Blockchain Center by Anna Ginsberg and Scott and Erica, Nick Spanos, you guys are the best. Thank you so much for organizing those. I believe there is a panel at 7 p.m. tomorrow, EST, 7 p.m. on Thursday, as well as part of the Blockchain Center. So everybody tune in. If you have any feedback, reach out to us so we could cover up some topics and questions next time. Jeff, thank you so much for such a great company, for such great answers. I actually personally learned a lot. Would love to learn more if there's an opportunity to do something like this again. Thank you so much.
Okay. My pleasure.
Cool. Thank you, sir. Bye-bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye, Jeff.